So, without further ado, Dr. Roger Lederer.
Thanks, Randy. Well, nice to be here. I've never been to this area. I've been in California for 50 years, but I've never been down here. So when I got invited, I thought, hey, this is a nice new thing to see to me. We were from Chico. That's not Chino, it's Chico. We're 500 miles north of here, so quite a ways. So it's all new territory for me. Okay, so I'm like Randy said, I'm a ornithologist. I spent in a recovering academic. I used to teach college for 30 years up at California State University, Chico, and I taught ecology and ornithology and things like that. And written 11 books, some along with my wife, Carol. And this is the latest one on art. I didn't know much about art before I took this one on, but I said, okay, sure, let's try it. So let me tell you what I know a little bit about bird art. There's an awful lot to know, and we're not going to cover very much of it, but at least it'll maybe get you a little bit interested in it, and hope you can see this screen's okay here. So every place you look in any stores, you look, you know, around on commercials on TV, billboards, anything like that. Birds are everywhere. Birds have been everywhere all the time, and people have used them as symbols for all sorts of things. And because of that, they've made art out of them. A lot of people are making a living out of bird art, all kinds of different ways, as I'll show you. So they've been in our life for an awful long time, and they're really a symbol of lots of different kinds of things. We go back even 40,000 years into Australia, and you've got bird art scratched on the wall of a cave somewhere that was probably an ancestor of today's emus. So these birds are so old that even prehistoric people had some versions of them that we didn't know about. And then you've seen all kinds of Egyptian art here. Here's Horus. You've seen that. It's got a head of a falcon, probably a peregrine falcon, that served as god of kingship and of the sky. And then Thoth, I guess that's how you pronounce it. They have a list. Thoth was the god of moon, wisdom, writing, and all sorts of other things. And he looked like an ibis. Now, ibises were really sacred in Egypt. You may not know how much, but in some of the pyramids in Egypt, there's one with a Saqqara pyramid. There were mummies of ibises, 40,000 mummies of ibises that were buried with the king. 40,000 mummies. So you imagine they captured 40,000 ibises. They not only captured 40,000 ibises, they actually used to breed. They had ibis zoos. We're talking 2,000 years ago. They had ibis breeding territories or breeding facilities, so they could raise ibises just so they could kill them, make mummies out of them, and bury them with the kings. So ibises are obviously very sacred. And all sorts of hieroglyphics. There are, how many letters we have in our alphabet? 26. They had 700 forms of hieroglyphics to make whatever they were making, and 26 of those were birds. So they had 26 birds alone for their symbols. And the one here, swallow, meant great. So if you had a swallow, somebody had to carve a swallow out of clay just to say the word great. And then the Chinese were known for all sorts of their bird paintings, and they went from landscapes and birds and flowers and figures, and then to birds alone. Although if you look at this picture, they threw in a couple of turtles. I'm not sure why. Now all these things were screen printed somehow. They were on textiles. They didn't have regular printing at that time, so they would paint on textiles with some sort of watercolors, usually using the colors from plants or rocks or something like that. And then here's Aristotle. Aristotle, 300 and some BC. Aristotle was one of the first scientists, although he got a lot of stuff wrong. One of the stories I like to tell about Aristotle is that he said that women had more teeth than men, never having counted Mrs. Aristotle's teeth, apparently. And he identified 123 species of birds, but then he identified them by, they were water birds or tree birds or desert birds or something like that. He really didn't have any particular way to organize them except by their behavior. But he did have 123 different names. And then he also looked at the swallows. See these two swallows here? They're a barn swallow, a cliff swallow in one and a barn swallow in the other. What they do, they flew over the water and then they disappeared. This was Greece, remember, this is Greece. And where are the birds going in wintertime in Greece? They went to Africa. They weren't going to stay. Greece got too cold, so they went to Africa. And Aristotle didn't know that because he didn't go to Africa. See, he hung around Greece all the time. And so he saw these birds dipping into the water, and he thought, okay, what they did was they dipped into the water, dove into the mud, and that's where they stayed for the winter. And so for years, and I'm talking 1,800 years, people thought that swallows buried themselves in the mud. And there were these little pictures like this. Here's fishermen actually fishing swallows out of the water. And this went on until the 1800s. You can read scientific literature for 1,800 years, and they thought that swallows actually buried themselves in the mud, except for one guy who thought that they went to the moon. And he said they flew 179,000 miles to the moon every year. At least he was close with the mileage, but he was wrong on the rest of it. Lots of these things, if you've ever traveled around and looked at mosaics or seen them in the museums, you see lots and lots of mosaics that the Romans had and the Greeks had put together. An awful lot of them have swans. Swans have become a real symbol of peace, of quality, of love, of all sorts of other kinds of things. And there's things like this. If we look in the Andes, the Andean earrings here, these are from 3rd or 4th century Peru. They aren't earrings, actually. They are, I don't know what you call them, plugs, but they put them in their earlobes to expand their earlobes, which some people still do now, but these are pretty fancy. And those are Andean condors. And here's a bowl, another sort of mosaic bowl, a peacock from the 10th century Iran. Peacocks are another one of the birds you see a lot in art because they're so fantastic and they're easy trained and they're very pretty, so people use them. In this case, they were guiding souls to heaven and repelling the devil. And I found this pretty interesting. In the Chinese Mongolian dynasties of the 12th and 13th, or 13th and 12th centuries, they hunted swans with gyrfalcons and actually had gyrfalcons. Now, falconry's been going on for 2,000 years, but here are gyrfalcons that the Chinese were using. And every year they had an autumn festival where people would bring their gyrfalcons and they'd hunt down swans. Why swans? I don't know, but they were big birds. And I just read the other day that they're still using gyrfalcons for falconry, especially in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, where the priests or the princes like these kinds of things. And one of the Saudi Arabian princes bought one of these trained falcons for $499,000. So if you want one, save your money. Okay, so here we are. So finally people are starting to put things down about birds that were actually sort of scientific. And here was the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II Hohenstaufen in his De Arte Venandi, or Art of Falconry. So this is the book about the art of falconry. It all had some stuff about birds in general. This was printed on parchment. That parchment is skin, a skin of sheep, skin of a cow, or something like that. Remember when people graduate from college, you get your sheepskin? I actually met a woman who, she was 101 when I met her. She graduated from the University of California at Berkeley in millinery, that is, hat making. She got a degree in it in 1922, and she had a literal sheepskin, had her degree on it up on the wall. So anyway, that's what they did at the time, because there really wasn't any good paper till years later. And he did the book on woodcuts. I'll show you in a minute what a woodcut is. If you probably get on a general idea, but. So ornithology was sort of, languishing. People learned a little bit about birds here and there, but it wasn't really becoming a science. But there were still lots of bird paintings going on. And then oil painting came about. Here's Jan van Eyck, famous Belgian painter, developed oil painting. Now they had dyes, from rocks and flowers and soil and stuff like that. This didn't have oil. Well, he mixed it with nut oil and linseed oil. So that's your first oil paintings. And this one is from it's actually a very big wooden altar piece. It's all painted on wood, as a lot of things were at that time. And then Conrad Gesner, Historia Animalium, again illustrated by woodcuts. Not always very accurate. He classified birds alphabetically, so albatrosses and, what's another bird? Begins with an A, or whatever. All the birds begin with an A are related. And some birds were imaginary. Now, these were the times where people didn't have binoculars, right? They couldn't see very far, so they'd see a bird up there and they'd describe it, and somebody else would describe it, and they put together a description. It was also true with fish. There were people who came up with species of fish by standing on a bridge and looking down and saying, okay, that's this species. And so a lot of these things, became really imaginary birds. Sometimes they were real birds, just badly described, but there were books later that had things that just never existed. So here's paper wasn't invented, well, it was invented by the Chinese about 200 BC, but it wasn't refined in Europe until about 1400. And that's when woodcuts could be used on, and I'll show you this little video here. This is about Gauguin, but it doesn't matter. So you had somebody who had to chip out all this wood from a wood block, and the hardest thing to do apparently is to go against the grain, so they tried to go with the grain as much as possible. And they had people some of the artists would collaborate. One of them would sketch things out on a wood block and somebody else would carve it. So you often had two artists on one block. Seemed very messy to me. You can still find books these days printed with wood blocks, but it's more for an artistic effect. But at this time, they really didn't have much else. So then you can use different colors, use one black, then use one yellow, use something else, and you get different effects from it. Okay, you get the idea. So then here, Pierre Bellone, 1517, 1564, published a book in French, Nature des, how do you pronounce that? Oiseaux. My wife knows French, it's oiseaux, right? Okay, published in Paris. What was interesting about this is pictures became a little bit better, a little bit more realistic, but he also published some information on internal anatomy, which people hadn't done before. And he was the first one to come up with the concept of homology. That is, he recognized that our hands are like bird hands, or bird hands are like our hands, and bat hands are like our hands, and whale hands or whale fins are like our hands, and porpoise. So he saw this relationship between all these things with arms or with wings that nobody else had before, that we all have ribs, we all have upper arms, we all have legs and skulls and so on. Sounds pretty simplistic now, but this was 500 years ago. And then here's another woodcut. I just thought this was an interesting woodcut. The people were eating birds at that time. I mean, they ate everything, all the birds. It didn't matter what it was, not like we eat just, chickens and ducks and stuff like that. No, they ate everything. And look at this picture. You can see it's all about bird hunting, and you can see there's owls that are tied up there so they'll attract little birds, and there's people hidden in the bushes with nets. And they put sticky glue, they like sap from trees, they put on trees, and birds would land on there and they'd get stuck on there. They still do that in Italy and Cyprus and Malta, places like that. They trap all these birds using sticky traps. But here at this time, nobody worried about any rules. And they call it trapping warblers and fig peckers, which fig peckers were just a name they had for actual, just other kind of warbler that ate figs. And when the birds got really full of figs, they were apparently really good to eat. So they went after, the hunters went after the fig peckers. And then there's another guy who had a big 14 volumes of natural history, mostly impressive in size and not accuracy. If you look at the left-hand side there, he's got eagles and hawks and quail and vultures all sort of on the first page, all together, things like that. So he's got a lot of stuff, but again, these guys slopped through it, got a whole bunch of books out, and didn't really care too much. Well, who knew anything about anything? If you wrote a book about birds, you were as good as the next guy who wrote a book about birds. And lots of these pictures, if you look through some pictures, you go into museums and so on, especially Dutch artists, an awful lot of these pantry or kitchen scenes, you see of all these things that were shot, stabbed, not poisoned, whatever they did to them. And they'd lay them all out like that, and you'd see, and usually you had a white bird, like this white merganser is in there, sort of attracting your attention. But there's all sorts of other birds there. You see all those little finches hanging out, shorebirds, everything like that. They just killed everything and laid it out in the pantry instead of fruit bowls. Here's another one, Fran Snyder's. And this is, again, a swan, a big white bird right in the middle. You often find big swans like that. And notice a little boy on the left over there. He's got a parrot. Parrots were big in a lot of these paintings. I'll show you in a minute. But these are sort of town markets. This is what they look like. Everything, all a wild game, just hanging around. And then, first look at the picture. There's a dodo and two parrots. Now, dodos lived on Madagascar, and the parrots lived in Africa. But they mixed them up in these paintings because who cared? But egg tempera was a common medium. Oil, that was just a mixed up egg yolk with dye and painted. And later on, oil painting, when it became more sophisticated, they used that, became more popular. Now, what happened here was a big shift in this. You can explain all these paintings. There was a big shift in what happened. All the explorers now in the 15th, 16th, 17th century were going all over the world from Europe, and they were going to Africa, South America, North America, who knows, Indonesia, and picking up all sorts of specimens. But what they got in terms of birds were the only ones that were going to make it back in the ship. It would take 3, 4, 5 months, and what birds are going to make it? They didn't know how to keep birds in a cage, finches and things like that. So what made it back? Ostriches, emus, kiwis, cassowaries, parrots, chickens, bigger birds like that we know how to keep pretty well, and that's what made it. And so people in Europe said, well, that's what's around the world, just these kinds of birds. And some of them, and the ones that made it alive anyway, but some of them also came over and they were shot and they were killed. And sometimes they would chop their tails off or chop their legs off just to save space in shipping, or they put them in alcohol. And so the colors changed and or they didn't look good, or they described these birds as without feet. In fact, there's some birds that are officially described as without feet. It just came from the fact that their feet were just cut off by the natives who caught these things. So here you see all sorts of things being painted, not quite realistic. Look at this toucan. The bill is just a little bit too big. And then there are lots and lots of Dutch paintings. The Dutch were really good at this kind of stuff. Of course, the Dutch were explorers and they were going all over the world. But you would think that Rembrandt would have had a lot of bird paintings, but he didn't. This is his only one. Rembrandt with a dead bittern. And parrots, you find lots and lots of parrots now, and especially parrots with a woman. Apparently parrots were something they represented femininity. And look at the parrot, they're African gray, lots of African gray parrots in these paintings. And it also represented people who were well-to-do. If you had a parrot, you were well-to-do. And this one, okay, it's not only the parrot, but look at the kid behind there. He's a page. Obviously, if you were well-to-do, you had a page. And so the artist put that in there and make sure you knew this woman was well-to-do. Anybody ever see that movie? What is it again? Oh, Tim's Vermeer. Watch this movie, Tim's Vermeer. It sounds weird, but it's about a guy named Tim who has a true story, but a guy who has a lot of money, who looks at a Vermeer painting and decides that, how did Vermeer do this painting? And he had an idea of how to do it. And so he did it. He went back to Holland, he got all the original paints, and he painted the painting himself, a very accurate copy of Vermeer, but it's a fascinating story. And one of the things he did was, see this tapestry there? He recreated a tapestry. He spent 9 months with a tiny little paintbrush painting that tapestry. It's a fascinating story, Tim's Vermeer. Okay, and then here we have another one, a woman plucking a duck, sitting there plucking a duck. Okay, and I mean, there's lots of artistic, cool stuff in here, the way the shadows are and so on. It takes a lot of artistic skill to do that. But notice there's a duck on the ground, and there's also a cat in there. Sometimes these painters couldn't paint other animals besides birds, so they would hire animaliaries. How do you pronounce that? Animalier, something like that. People who painted animals, they would ask them to paint animals into their pictures for them. So somebody probably painted that cat in there for them. And then there are people who just sort of wanted to paint birds, but they really didn't care anything about natural history or taxonomy or anything like that. They just wanted to paint a whole bunch of birds, and that was Melchior de Hondecoeter. He painted bird subjects in park-like landscapes. Look at this one on the left. It's got a dog and a hare and a couple of birds hanging from the couch or from a basket and a chicken. And the other one, which I think is really weird, is a little park-like setting there where he's got a cockatiel from Australia, an African gray parrot, a couple of parrots from South America, a North American northern cardinal, and a couple of monkeys. So it's just sort of, he's just showing off his skill. People, I guess, wanted these kinds of paintings. And then we finally start to see ornithology come out as a science. And this is, has anybody here read this book? This is a really good book to read. It's The Ornithology of Francis Willoughby. Willoughby and Ray were two guys from England who really start putting together all the information known about birds. They went out and collected birds, looked at other people's collections, and really made an effort to organize things. And Willoughby died about 25 years before Ray, so Ray finished it up. But these two guys are really well known in history of ornithology for starting ornithology as a science. But we still had, even though these years were going on, we still had a lot of people painting these kinds of things. Notice again, a big white swan got to attract your attention right to the middle of the painting. And a dead rabbit, there's always a dead rabbit and a big white swan and these things, with a little dog looking on and those kinds of things. But notice this guy, Jan Wenix, is known for his exceptional rendering of feathers and fur. If you look really closely, imagine how difficult it is if any of you do any painting, whether it's watercolor or oils or anything like that, how difficult it is to make it look that realistic. And I've looked at a lot of these paintings up close and personal when we've been in museums in Europe, and it's just amazing how they can do that, just like photography. Okay, and this one you may have heard of. This is the Goldfinch. The book was written by Donna Tartt, and it became famous. The book became famous, and they made a movie out of it. I didn't like the movie, but who cares? This is a little painting, and when we were in Europe last fall, when we went on a cruise, ended up in Amsterdam, and I wanted to go see this painting just because I'm an ornithologist. I want to see the painting for no other reason. It's only about this big. It's a small painting, and it's in it's in The Hague, the Moritz House, a small museum in The Hague. So we went there. Now, you know, one of these paintings, you think, okay, Donna Tartt wrote this book, and there's a movie out there, going to be 1 million people there. We walked in the room, we were the only ones there. So Carol took my picture next to this painting. But it's a pretty cool painting. It's the only one done by Carl Fabricius of a bird. There's only about 6 or 7 paintings actually that exist by Carl Fabricius. And he was blown up in a explosion. There was a military storage house of explosive that somehow in Delft, Netherlands, somehow he got caught up in it and blew up half the town, including him and most of his paintings. So this is one that's left, but it's the only one he's done of a bird. So it's fairly special. Now you get lots of these paintings, again, as I said, as people brought specimens over. If the artist didn't have access to some zoo, well, it's usually not a zoo, usually some rich people had some birds in their backyard somewhere. They'd have a little zoo of their own. They're all private zoos. If the guy couldn't get access to it, the artist, then he would make up stuff, or you could look at dead specimens, or he just listen to somebody's description and say, okay, how should I paint this thing? And so you get these misshapen little things. Here's a flamingo. It doesn't quite look right, a guinea fowl, but you know, it's pretty close. And then there's some that are really good. These are 2 gyrfalcons. This is the same guy, Jacob Bogdani, only in this case he had somebody's falcons and he got a good look at them, and so you can see he's really got the skills when the birds are available. I like this one sort of. This guy, Joseph Wright, did a lot of paintings of science. I'm sorry it's so dark, but I try to lighten it up. But all his paintings are like that. They're all dark. But they're all about scientific experiments. And this is one, it's called An Experiment on a Bird in an Air Pump. What he did was put a bird in a jar and suck the air out with a pump and made a vacuum in there showing that you need oxygen. Now remember, this is 1768. Everybody didn't know you need oxygen. So he proved it by killing birds in a jar. And this is the painting of it. Lots of people, we didn't have museums then in the 1700s, but we had lots of individual, well-to-do people, again, who had their own museums called cabinets of curiosities. And they'd have these things full of all sorts of specimens that were collected for them all over the world. And later, these became museum things after these people died and they were donated. And then another leap in ornithology, Mark Catesby, who was an Englishman, came over to the U.S. actually twice, made 2 different trips, and really did a close examination of the history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. And he drew pretty well the pictures, not all that great, but he had some ideas of ecology, of natural history, and migration. He finally said, no, birds don't go to the moon, they go someplace. Going this way or that way, he was wrong, and which way they went, but at least they didn't go to the moon and they didn't dive in under the mud. So he added to our knowledge there. But you can see his paintings aren't, well, actually a copper etching in this case. So away from the wood etching, he went to copper etching, and then they hand colored it later. It became very popular. But notice this nighthawk. Nighthawks don't walk around the ground like that. Their mounts aren't quite that flexible, but you know, what could he do? He didn't, again, you didn't have binoculars, so you did the best you could. And then we got the guy who saved biology, as far as I'm concerned, Carl von Linnaeus. He invented the Linnaean system for naming animals and naming plants by using scientific names. So we had kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species, as we do now. Not everybody bought into it right away, but he's the one who invented it. And then we had this guy, and a lot of these people were becoming very prolific. He wrote 44 volumes. You imagine that, writing 44 volumes of books, 8 on birds. Now, he ignored Linnaeus, but so did everybody else at that time. George Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. He's the guy who stood on the bridge and described fish by watching them swim under the bridge. But, you know, you have to put this in perspective. This is so many years ago, that sounds stupid, but it really wasn't at that particular time. And Alexander Wilson, called the father of American ornithology. So he was the one that really the first guy who really tried to paint all the birds of North America. And he, like Audubon and Mark Twain, what these guys did was sold subscriptions. They'd paint a bird and they'd sell it to people, and they'd go around, deliver it, and say, okay, you give me your money and I'll paint another bird, and they go on. It's sort of, you know, chapter by chapter or page by page. I think Charles Dickens did this too, didn't he? So he made a living doing that, and he inspired artists like Audubon. In fact, he tried to sell his stuff to Audubon. Audubon was running a mercantile at that particular time, and he went there and tried to sell Audubon, and Audubon didn't buy it. And Audubon's brother told him, he said, hey, you can paint better than that. And he went on to do that. And so we get to Audubon, who is probably the most famous bird painter of all time. He came over from Haiti at the age of 18, and then ran for several years, ran a mercantile shop with his brother, and then got thrown in jail for not paying his bills for a year, and then decided he was going to go out and start painting all these birds. Now, he went out and shot the birds, and then he would wire them up in the trees to make them look like they were realistic. So some of this stuff is a little bent out of shape. And if you see some of his pictures, not this one here, but they're like a heron. The heron neck is bent over because he used these big 44-inch pieces of paper, but he couldn't fit the heron on there, so he'd bend it. So that's why some of his stuff looks a little crooked. So here's his copper engraving, and he would engrave copper on copper, and then he would hire a whole bunch of other artists to paint the colors in. He didn't do all the painting himself. Unfortunately, he plagiarized some of Wilson's paintings. Did 435 aquatint paintings, and you can look at Audubon on the left and Wilson on the right. Wilson's paintings 35, 40 years before, they look a lot alike, and you can find several of them like that. So Audubon was cheating. So was this guy. This guy was not a nice guy, but he was an excellent artist. John Gould, really known for, first of all, a book on English birds, and then especially a book on Australian birds. He spent years shooting Australian birds and painting them, but he was an excellent painter. Unfortunately, he was a real jerk, according to people who worked for him. The guy that worked for him for 40 years on his deathbed said John Gould's a bastard. He worked for him for 40 years, but never said a word to him until he almost died. But John Gould also made a living and a reputation on his wife, Elizabeth Gould, who apparently was a much better artist than he was. She did birds of Europe, birds in the Himalayas, birds of Australia, and illustrated some of Darwin's manuscripts. But most of the artworks were signed by John Gould, rarely by Elizabeth Gould. But she was a much better painter, and she learned lithograph, which John Gould never learned. This is one of her lithographs. And here's, if you don't know how to do lithographs, here's a quick little lesson on that. So instead of wood, we're using a block of stone now, limestone. This to me seems like an awful lot of work. So they have to rub all the limestone, get it nice and smooth. So then they etch it, and anyway, then they put a piece of paper over it and run it through a press. I don't want to go through all that, but what I'm mostly impressed is how clean these guys' hands are. I know what mine would look like if I tried to do this. Then they print it on a big press, and then they want different colors. They keep putting different colors on. And you may put 5, 6, 10 different colors on. Some lithographs. So lithographs, that's why they're so expensive. There's a lot of work done with it. Okay, well, you know, up until 1825, there weren't any binoculars. There were telescopes, but people didn't use them to look at birds. It was too hard to hold one little lens like that, and the glass wasn't all that good in it. So binoculars were invented in 1825, but again, they weren't really used for bird watching because they were really hard. Again, the glass wasn't very good. So it took a while. It wasn't until the late 1800s when you start getting some really good binoculars. And then Florence Miriam published Birds Through a Looking Glass and the Handbook of Birds of the Western United States. But she had 500 pages and 600 woodcuts, so it was pretty big. You couldn't stick this in your pocket and go for a bird guide. And Fuertes and Ridgway, a couple of more minor artists, did the illustrations. But this is the first real field guide. And then we started getting some really good artists who did monographs on lots of birds. So this is the guy, Natural History of the Pheasant. So he did a whole book on pheasants. William Beebe. This is a picture in 1917 out in the field. And you can see how terrific that lithograph is. And another one, 1922, Natural History of the Ducks. So by this time, art has really gotten very good, bird art. People knew how to do it with lithographs and watercolors and oil paints and things like that. And we finally get to the modern era where Roger Tory Peterson used gouache, pen, and ink. Gouache is sort of like acrylic. And he did the first field guide to the birds. But he was a pretty good artist when he was a kid. And then he went in the Army and worked early World War II. and he drew all the silhouettes of enemy planes and ships. So he had made a guide to the enemy and friendly, so that all the soldiers and sailors knew what kinds of ships and planes were coming. So that's how he got some practice in his art. And then he decided he was going to go make a field guide to the birds. So he drew up all the birds of the eastern U.S., put it in a book, and went to a whole bunch of publishers, and nobody wanted to take him. He's got turned down by about 25 publishers. And finally, Houghton Mifflin accepted his work, and it went crazy. Sold 2,000 copies right away, and they had to make much more printing. So they made an awful lot of money. And all the other printers were probably kicking themselves. But he became the field guide standard. If you see all these little lines there on the birds' heads, those are field marks that every other bird guide has used since. But we've had other artists in between. I think this guy's fantastic. J. Frederick Lansdowne, who in 1979, he died, I think in about that time, a little bit later than that. Watercolors, this is incredible. He had his first show at the age of 14. So a lot of these artists that I talked about really started to learn when they were 5, 10, 15 years old. And then this is a colleague of mine. I just wanted to show her pictures. These are lithographs or lino cuts using linoleum instead of woodcuts. But what was interesting about her is she used the whole bird. The picture would take up the birds would take up the entire picture. Whatever she had, guinea fowl or an owl or ducks or swans or things like that. Pretty fantastic stuff. And then the latest, of course, the guy who you all know is David Allen Sibley, who's still around painting. He's got a book on trees as well. And he's been painting ever since he was a kid. And he is now the standard bird guide artist. But there's also some other ones, a couple of quick ones to point out that are really interesting. It's Elizabeth Butterworth. All she does is parrot parts. She does wings and heads, and she keeps live parrots that she paints from. And I think they're absolutely fantastic, the detail of the barbs of the feathers and eyes and everything else. And then this is very weird, I think, but it's really interesting. These are woodcocks, and the guy's painting a woodcock with a woodcock feather. And there are several people who do that. They just specialize in painting pictures of woodcocks using woodcock feathers. I don't know how much money is in it, but it's sort of interesting. And then the one here I think is fantastic. This guy cuts out little silhouettes of birds from feathers and posts them up like that. This particular one, which is about 18 inches by 18 inches, it's framed in glass, is $1,800. And I think it's probably worth it if you got that kind of money for that kind of work. That's pretty amazing. So that's a quick review of birds and art. There's a lot more to be seen, and I'm sure you can go places and find it. So thank you very much.
So I appreciate your joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I did, and we will look forward to seeing you again. We'll stay open as long as people are here. If you need any help with any wild bird supplies or gifts, we're here to help you with that as well. And I think our friend Robert, one of our friends of Chirp, is going to play us away. So anyway, thank you, everyone. Have a good night.